The snow fell heavy that night, swallowing the small town in silence. It blanketed the world in a white so thick it seemed to erase everything except the faint glow of a few lonely streetlights. Roads disappeared beneath drifts, cars sat abandoned on the roadside, and the winds howled through the empty streets like restless ghosts. At the very edge of town, tucked behind a crooked picket fence, stood a little wooden house with smoke curling steadily from its chimney. Inside, a kind old lady named Margaret sat alone by her fire, knitting quietly. Her gray hair was neatly pinned back, her wrinkled hands moved with steady grace despite the storm's rage, and the rhythmic sound of her needles was the only company she had. Margaret had lived through many winters in that house, but this one felt especially lonely. Her husband had been gone for years, and her children, now grown, were scattered across distant cities with lives of their own. The nights had begun to feel longer than the days, and the silence of her home seemed to stretch endlessly. That evening, as the blizzard roared louder against her windows, she closed her eyes, whispering a soft prayer that anyone caught out in the cold might somehow find warmth and shelter. She could not have known how quickly that prayer was about to be answered, nor how completely her quiet life was about to change. The knock came suddenly, rattling the old door with such force that Margaret nearly dropped her knitting. She froze, her heart pounding against her chest. At her age, unannounced visitors in the middle of a snowstorm were almost unheard of, and for a brief moment she considered ignoring it. But curiosity and a sense of duty pulled her to her feet. She wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders, shuffled toward the door, and slowly pulled it open. What she saw made her gasp. Standing on her porch in the whirling snow were 15 men, broad-shouldered and leather-clad. Their jackets marked with patches that carried a name feared by many, Hell's Angels. Their beards were crusted with ice, their faces raw and red from the bitter cold, and their heavy boots sank deep into the snow. Behind them, their motorcycles leaned precariously against one another, almost completely buried beneath the drift, their chrome dulled and frozen white. For a moment Margaret felt her knees weaken. These were men people crossed the street to avoid, men whose reputations traveled faster than their engines. But as her eyes lingered on them, she noticed something that softened her fear. Beneath the hardened exteriors, beneath the leather, tattoos, and frostbitten scowls, they were shivering. Their lips were blue, their hands stiff with cold, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. Whatever their pasts might have been, tonight they were nothing more than human beings caught in a storm that could easily claim their lives. Without another moment of hesitation, Margaret stepped aside and, in her gentle but firm voice, said, "Come in before you freeze." The men exchanged startled glances, their surprise clear. Most doors had been slammed in their faces, most people treated them as outcasts, troublemakers, or worse. Yet here stood a frail old woman, no taller than their shoulders, opening her warm home to them without hesitation or judgment. One by one they filed inside, stomping snow from their boots, shaking the ice from their jackets, and filling her tiny living room until it seemed to grow smaller beneath the sheer presence of leather and steel. The quiet, lonely space that had only moments before held the sound of knitting needles and crackling fire was now alive with the weight of 15 weary souls thawing in the glow of Margaret's heart. Margaret didn't waste a moment once the men were inside. She hurried to the kitchen, pulling out whatever she could find, half a loaf of bread, a few cans of soup, the leftover stew from her dinner. It wasn't much. But she served it with a smile, moving about her kitchen as though she had been expecting this company all along. The bikers sat awkwardly in the cramped living room, their massive frames squeezed onto her floral-patterned couches and stiff wooden chairs, unsure how to behave in such a gentle setting. They weren't used to kindness like this. They weren't used to being looked at as men in need, rather than men to be feared. Yet in that tiny wooden house, under the watchful warmth of Margaret's care, something began to shift. Outside, the storm raged fiercer, pounding against the windows like a beast desperate to break in. The winds howled louder, rattling the eaves and sweeping snow higher against the door. Inside, however, the fire glowed and the small room filled with a fragile peace. The bikers began to talk, their rough voices softening as they told Margaret bits of their story. They had been traveling from state to state when the blizzard caught them off guard. With highways shut down and the only motel in town already full, they had found themselves stranded. Their motorcycles were nearly frozen solid, and without shelter they knew they wouldn't have survived the night. Margaret listened intently, her eyes kind and steady, her hands busy pouring hot coffee into mismatched mugs and setting out blankets she had tucked away years ago. One by one, exhaustion overcame them. The tough bikers, men who carried reputations that made most people cross the street, wrapped themselves in quilts that smelled faintly of lavender and age. Soon, the little house was filled with the sound of their snores, deep and unguarded, echoing through the small rooms. Margaret stayed awake long into the night, watching them sleep in the warm glow of the fire. A strange sense of contentment filled her heart. She had never had sons of her own, but tonight, just for a moment, she felt as though she had been blessed with 15 of them. By dawn, the storm had broken. The world outside glistened with new snow, sparkling like a sea of diamonds in the pale morning light. The bikers stirred, stretching their stiff limbs, rubbing their tired eyes, and thanking Margaret in voices still rough with sleep. She served them a simple breakfast, scrambled eggs, toast, and strong coffee, and watched them eat with gratitude plain on their faces. When they finally stepped back out into the morning air, they found their bikes half buried beneath the drifts, but still intact. They brushed them off, tested their engines, and prepared to leave. Before they mounted their rides, their leader, a tall man with steel-gray eyes, paused. He turned to Margaret, his voice firm yet sincere as he said, "Ma'am, we won't forget this. Ever." Margaret only smiled, patted his arm, and wished them safe travels. Then, just as quickly as they had appeared, the 15 bikers roared away, the thunder of their engines fading into the distance, leaving Margaret once again in her quiet, snowbound home. She thought that was the end of it, a strange but beautiful memory of one snowy night when her house became a sanctuary for men the world often called dangerous. But kindness has a way of echoing, multiplying, and returning when one least expects it. The very next morning, as Margaret stood in her snowy yard scattering crumbs for the birds, she heard a sound that made her stop in her tracks. At first, it was faint, like the distant roll of thunder across the hills. Then it grew louder, deeper, until the ground itself seemed to tremble beneath her feet. Margaret clutched her shawl tighter, her heart racing as she stepped toward the crooked picket fence. Down the long road leading to her little house, she saw them, motorcycles. Not 10. Not 20. But one after another, engines roaring, headlights glowing in the cold morning air. Dozens of riders came into view, their leather jackets marked with the same insignia she had seen the night before. They stretched down the road as far as her eyes could see, a river of chrome and steel snaking toward her home. One by one, they pulled up and lined both sides of the street, surrounding her house in a semicircle of thunder and frost. The roar of their engines filled the air, mingling with the sharp scent of gasoline and the crisp bite of snow. Margaret stood still, breathless, staring at the sight before her. Hundreds of bikers, united in a way she could not have imagined, all come to the doorstep of a woman who had given 15 strangers shelter on a stormy night. Neighbors peeked nervously from behind their curtains, their faces pressed to the glass, unsure of what was unfolding on the snow-covered street. Dozens upon dozens of motorcycles lined the road in front of Margaret's house, their engines growling like thunder restrained. To most, the sight was intimidating, fearsome even. But Margaret did not flinch. She stood by her crooked picket fence, her shawl drawn tightly around her shoulders, her breath curling into the cold air. For a moment she was speechless, her heart swelling until tears welled in her eyes. From the front of the line, the tall leader she had met the night before swung his leg over his bike and dismounted. He walked toward her slowly, something hidden in his hand. His smile wasn't the sly grin of mischief one might expect from a man with his reputation. Instead, it was warm, genuine, a smile that carried with it both respect and deep gratitude. When he finally reached her, he extended his hand and placed a bouquet of fresh flowers in hers. Margaret gasped softly, her fingers trembling as she accepted them. In the dead of winter, with the ground frozen solid and the world wrapped in snow, she knew how difficult it must have been to find such a gift. The leader's voice was steady but tender as he said, "We told the brothers what you did for us. Word spread. You gave us shelter when no one else would. We don't forget things like that." Margaret's lips parted, but before she could reply, her eyes widened at the sight behind him. From the backs of their motorcycles, the riders began unloading gifts, bags of groceries filled to the brim, stacks of firewood neatly tied, boxes heavy with warm clothes, blankets, and other supplies. Some carried tools and went straight to work repairing her broken fence, shoveling her driveway clear of snow, and fixing the squeaky hinge on her porch door that had groaned for years. For hours, her little house and quiet yard were transformed. The once silent property now pulsed with life, the clatter of hammers, the scrape of shovels, the rumble of engines, and, above all, the deep laughter of men who, for a moment, had put aside their hard edges to serve a woman who had once served them. Margaret stood watching, her heart fuller than it had been in years. She hadn't felt this alive, this surrounded by family, in so long. That day, she realized something profound: kindness is never wasted. It ripples outward, touching lives in ways one can never predict, and often comes back magnified 100-fold. What she had given so freely, with no expectation of return, had found its way back to her in abundance. In a world that often seemed cold, fractured, and divided, she discovered that even the hardest hearts could be softened by compassion. These men, so often branded as dangerous, carried within them loyalty, honor, and gratitude that few ever witnessed. As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the snow in shades of gold and rose, the bikers gathered once more in front of her yard. Their engines roared to life in unison, a thunderous salute that shook the ground and echoed across the valley. Margaret stood on her porch, flowers clutched to her chest, her eyes glistening with tears as she raised her hand to wave. One by one, the riders departed, their silhouettes shrinking against the glowing sky, their engines fading into the distance until the town was quiet once more. But though silence returned to the valley, Margaret knew her house would never again feel empty. Within its walls lingered the memory of laughter, the warmth of unexpected family, and the unshakable truth she had learned, that even in the coldest storm, kindness has the power to light a fire that never goes out.